World leaders were seconds from war until a janitor's daughter crawled under a stage, touched a broken wire, and saved humanity. The world didn't end in fire or silence. It ended in confusion. One moment. 173 nations sat beneath the same roof, ready to sign the most ambitious AI treaty in history. The next, language itself collapsed. Arabic bled into Swedish, Portuguese into static. Delegates shouted, fingers pointed, headsets were ripped off, and somewhere between the flicker of panic and the hum of failing systems, the future unraveled in real time. Technicians scrambled, protocols failed, and just when the chaos reached its peak, she appeared not on the screen, not in the script, but beneath the stage, unnoticed. A 9-year-old girl in an orange floral dress. No badge, no clearance, just a backpack full of napkins, and a memory too sharp for her age. While the world's brightest minds froze, she reached for a cable no one had seen, made a single adjustment, and restored communication across the globe. Then she vanished. No name. No thank you. Just a silence deeper than applause. But one man saw her, and that moment changed everything. It was supposed to be the most important summit of the decade, the Global AI and Security Conference, held in a gleaming glass hall in Portland, Oregon, where 173 nations gathered to shape the future of human-machine collaboration. Delegates arrived in waves, scientists with clipped badges, generals in tailored suits, humanitarian leaders balancing hope with realism. The room buzzed with anticipation, every seat occupied, every screen alive. At the center of the stage stood the pinnacle of human innovation, a 12-foot quantum translation server designed to process and convert any spoken language in real time, Arabic to Swedish, Japanese to English, Farsi to Portuguese, all in under 300 milliseconds. The promise was clarity, understanding, peace. That promise shattered 14 seconds before the opening remarks. A Hungarian delegate leaned into his mic and Mandarin spilled out. Seconds later, a Brazilian diplomat tried to respond, but his voice came out as fractured binary. Confusion spread like fire. Words clashed. Mistranslations stacked on top of each other. Someone shouted sabotage. Others ripped off their headsets, furious. Screens flickered. Delegates stood, pacing, yelling, gesturing wildly in languages no one could now comprehend. The system had failed hard. Panic rose beneath the polished surface. The live feed broadcasting globally hesitated, then cut to a neutral standby screen. Technicians scrambled like bees in a smoking hive, huddled around diagnostics they couldn't decipher fast enough. It was as if humanity's ability to understand itself had been unplugged in real time, and no one knew who had pulled the cord. But just off stage, through a hallway meant for maintenance staff, a child slipped past an unsecured checkpoint. She wasn't supposed to be there. She wasn't supposed to exist in this room of brilliance. But while power met confusion with panic, she met it with silence and a memory built not in classrooms, but in utility closets. The first sign that something had gone wrong was subtle a pause, a confused glance, the slight frown of a delegate trying to make sense of a sentence that came out wrong. Then, within seconds, the entire translation system collapsed. Languages didn't just stop working, they mutated. Spanish turned into staccato Korean, English into garbled static, Arabic into something that sounded like code corrupted in a storm. Delegates leaned closer to their microphones, hoping it was a glitch, but each attempt to speak only deepened the confusion. Words collided in midair, unrecognizable to both speakers and listeners. A South African ambassador shouted into her headset, only to hear her own voice echo back in clipped Mandarin. A Swedish engineer asked a question, but what came through was a stream of fractured Slavic phrases. Confusion turned to alarm. Heads swiveled, arms raised. Accusations began to fly, not in coordinated speech, but in raw noise. Some suspected a cyber attack. Others whispered sabotage, and within a minute, the high ideals of the summit dissolved into disorder. People stood up, stepped over chairs, ripped off earpieces, demanding to know who was responsible. The AI-driven server at the center of it all, a polished marvel of copper, glass, and quantum circuits, blinked erratically like a heart in distress. Technicians huddled around it, frantic, but unable to regain control. One interface screen showed looping error codes: pathway collision, decoder fail, dialect overload. It was as if every language tried to speak at once, and none could be heard. Security guards exchanged nervous glances, unable to calm the room. A few delegates slammed folders shut. Others left the stage altogether. It wasn't just technical failure, it was symbolic collapse. A room built for global unity had lost its ability to understand itself. And amid the chaos, no one noticed the small girl slipping silently behind the server tower. While the experts panicked and the world's most secure translation system spiraled into chaos, no one noticed the small figure moving at the edge of the commotion. Ellie, 9 years old, wearing a slightly wrinkled orange dress with faded flowers, stepped through a side hallway meant only for maintenance. She didn't have a badge. She didn't need one. The security scanners, built to detect threats based on behavioral and biometric profiles, didn't flag her because no one had ever programmed the system to register a child under 10 as a possible agent of interference. Her shoes were worn, her backpack patched, and her hands carried the faint scent of soldering dust and old wires. She moved with a calm that felt almost unnatural in a space dominated by panic. Her mother, a janitor assigned to the summit's night crew, was somewhere mopping floors at the far end of the building, completely unaware that her daughter had slipped away after school and found her way back to the hall she always waited in during long shifts. Ellie didn't rush. She walked steadily toward the central quantum server 12 feet tall, blinking with confused light, cables twitching with residual current. To her, it wasn't a monument of global ambition. It looked like a broken puzzle. Her fingers, small but sure, found the access panel low to the ground, half hidden behind the stage platform. She crouched as if tying her shoe, pulling up the sleeves of her denim vest to reveal grease-stained arms. Earlier that morning, she had taken apart a broken radio while waiting for her mother to finish cleaning the executive restroom. She hadn't drawn attention. She never did. She listened. She watched. And when things broke, she remembered how they fit together, while the room above screamed in misaligned voices. Ellie gently reached inside the server's tangled belly, not with fear, but with understanding. Ellie didn't have blueprints, manuals, or even a screen in front of her. What she had was memory, one moment months ago, when she'd watched a technician fix the server while she waited in the janitor's supply closet after school. She remembered how he'd bypassed the decoder chip and mumbled something about input conflicts, how his fingers had hovered over a grounding loop before adjusting a connector so small most wouldn't have noticed it. That memory came back now like a whispered instruction. Kneeling beneath the tower, Ellie's fingers moved quickly, brushing past fiber optics and copper lines, searching not with sight but with feel. One bundle buzzed faintly with heat, too much current trapped by a failsafe switch. She unclipped the bypass and rerouted it. Another connector hung just loose enough to disconnect the feedback relay. She pressed it firmly into place. No sparks, no warning alarms, just a subtle click. Then, a hum, soft, low, barely audible, like a sleeping giant taking its first breath. The lights on the tower blinked wildly, then stabilized. Diagnostic screens flickered to life one by one. Across the hall, Headsets began to sync again. A Nigerian delegate blinked, stunned, as English poured through her earpiece. A Japanese interpreter gasped as kanji scrolled cleanly across her display. Confusion faded into silence, then into relief. The summit's main screen updated system stabilized, translation fully restored. But no one saw Ellie. She didn't stand. She didn't celebrate. She dusted her hands against her dress, slid backward from the access panel, and melted into the corridor she came from. Technicians stared at their terminals in disbelief. The lead engineer, mid-call with an emergency override team, lowered his phone. "Who fixed it?" he whispered. But there was no answer. Just one open panel and the faint echo of small footsteps already gone. Thomas Hale, the U.S. Secretary of Technology, had witnessed enough staged miracles in his career to know when one wasn't staged. As others clapped for the sudden restoration of order and muttered relief about backup systems finally kicking in, he stayed perfectly still, eyes locked on the quantum server tower. While heads turned back to their tablets and translators exhaled in disbelief, he watched something else movement at the edge of the chaos. Subtle, almost invisible, a small figure, not in a uniform, not in a suit, slipping quietly into the service hallway. No badge, no escort, no urgency, just a child. For a moment he doubted himself, but the image stuck a girl in an orange dress, hands dusted with machine grease, disappearing into the shadows. Not running, not hiding, just leaving. As the summit resumed, Hale stood and walked out mid-speech, ignoring puzzled glances from aides trailing behind. He moved swiftly through the backstage corridors, past interns and tech crews scrambling to recalibrate the timeline. He wasn't looking for answers from a system. He was chasing the source of something that didn't belong and yet somehow fit. Past a stack of unused cables near a far wall, he stopped. There she was, sitting cross-legged on the floor, back to the world she had just repaired, sketching quietly on a torn scrap of paper. He saw the drawing before he saw her face, a hand-drawn circuit schematic. Not copied, but imagined complete with corrected logic points and handwritten notations in blocky, deliberate letters. When she finally glanced up, there was no fear in her eyes, just readiness. Hale knelt beside her, not as a dignitary, but as someone asking for permission. "Your name?" he asked gently. She didn't answer with words. She simply pointed to the corner of the paper where she had written, Ellie. No last name. Just that. Ellie lived in a low-rise apartment complex on the edge of Portland, tucked behind an aging grocery store and a laundromat that hummed until midnight. The kind of place no one photographed, where cracked pavement and rusted stair rails were part of the scenery, and where hard-working families held their lives together with second shifts, expired bus passes, and quiet resilience. She shared a one-bedroom unit with her mother, Rosa Miller, a night janitor who scrubbed the summit halls when no one was watching. Rosa left for work every evening before the sun dipped below the skyline, her uniform folded neatly, her name tag clipped on with care even though no one ever used it. Ellie stayed behind, usually with her backpack on and a screwdriver in hand, surrounded by bits of salvaged electronics she'd pulled from neighborhood dumpsters or the recycling bins near the tech repair store. She never complained about the wait. The apartment was warm enough, quiet enough, and Rosa always left a sandwich and a handwritten note before every shift. Be good. Be safe. I love you. Most nights. Ellie would walk with her to the transit stop, then loop back and lose herself in the rhythm of wires, circuits, and the steady hum of broken things whispering to be fixed. No one had ever taught Ellie how to fix machines. There were no textbooks on her shelf, no online classes streaming through old tablets, no adults guiding her hand. What she had was observation hours spent sitting quietly in janitor closets and back corridors while her mother cleaned corporate buildings after hours. At the Summit building, where Rosa had picked up an extra contract, Ellie often sat cross-legged behind the server room's side wall, nestled beside mop buckets and crates of paper towels, silently watching the technicians through the slats of the maintenance door. She memorized everything, not just what they did, but how they moved. One technician in particular, a tired man with coffee-stained cuffs, had once muttered to himself as he worked, annoyed at a faulty power bypass. Ellie had watched his fingers hover over a cluster of tangled fiber lines, pause, then shift a single connector half a centimeter and reroute the grounding flow. He didn't even realize anyone had seen. But Ellie had. She'd replayed that motion in her mind 100 times, like a song lyric she couldn't forget. She didn't just remember the steps, she remembered the rhythm, the hesitation, the pressure. Machines, to her, were never lifeless. They whispered their stories if you listened close enough. Thomas Hale found her exactly where he suspected she might be, tucked into the corner of a service hallway, seated cross-legged on the floor beside a forgotten coil of cables, her head bent over a crumpled napkin covered in pencil marks. She didn't look up as he approached. Instead, she continued sketching a circuit loop with steady hands, unfazed by the sudden presence of a man in a tailored suit and polished shoes. He didn't speak. He didn't offer praise or questions. He simply sat down beside her, the cold concrete pressing into his knees as he lowered himself carefully, trying not to tower or intrude. For a few minutes, they said nothing. The air between them held no pressure. When Ellie finally slid the napkin a few inches toward him, he understood it was an invitation, not for conversation, but for attention. He studied the diagram clean, purposeful, annotated in small blocky letters with logic nodes and corrected error paths, and he recognized it instantly. Not just as a schematic of the Summit server, but as something improved. She had seen the flaw. She had fixed it instinctively. Instead of speaking, he pulled out a worn notepad from his coat pocket and began to sketch a logic gate. Ellie leaned over, glanced once, then tapped the pencil against a missing connection. He smiled faintly and corrected it. In that moment, nothing needed to be explained. There were no lessons, no lectures, just presence. They sat like that for a long while. Two people from separate worlds exchanging knowledge in silence. The only sound between them, the faint scratch of graphite on napkin paper. It happened without warning. Thomas had been sitting beside Ellie again that afternoon, as he often did now, bringing small tools or scraps of circuitry for her to tinker with, never instructions, never praise, just offerings placed quietly on the floor beside her like pieces of a language only she could fully speak. She had been drawing in her notebook, the same soft-covered one held together by a wrap of tape and elastic, pages thick with weeks of diagrams, notes, and fragments of brilliance no teacher had ever assigned. He wasn't watching her hands directly, but from the corner of his eye. He saw her pause, hesitate, then slowly print something at the top corner of a page, Ellie H. At first, the name didn't register. Then it landed with full weight. H. His own initial. His chest tightened as he turned toward her, unsure what to say or whether to say anything at all. But she had already noticed. Her gaze followed his, and in an instant her entire posture changed. She slammed the notebook shut with such force that her pencil skittered across the tile. Her face flushed dark, her jaw clenched, not in anger, but fear. Not fear of him, but of having something exposed too early, too intimately, without a word. She grabbed her bag and ran down the hallway, opposite the way she usually left. Thomas stayed frozen on the ground, still staring at the now closed notebook, the moment stretching out with a pang of guilt and realization. He hadn't meant to see something so personal, but he had, and now he feared he'd broken something fragile he never intended to touch. Thomas Hale waited near the back entrance of the summit building, just beyond the industrial shelves stacked with bleach and mop buckets, his ministerial pin tucked into his coat pocket to avoid drawing attention. He wasn't there with cameras or advisors, just a single envelope in hand. When Rosa Miller appeared, still in her janitor uniform with her name badge hanging lopsided from the clip, she stopped cold upon seeing him. Her face held no fear, only guarded suspicion. She had cleaned rooms where power gathered, and she'd learned early that power rarely arrived without cost. "May I speak with you?" he asked quietly. "You already are," she replied, crossing her arms. He nodded, accepting the rebuke. Then he extended the envelope. "Your daughter is exceptional," he said. "I've seen what she can do, what she's already done." Rosa didn't take it. "She's a child," she said flatly. "And I've seen how people like you use children when it suits you." He didn't flinch. "This isn't about using her. It's about giving her space to grow." He gently placed the envelope on a nearby crate. "It's a full scholarship. The Vermont Institute of Applied Systems. She'd live on campus. Everything covered: tuition, housing, meals, nothing asked in return." Rosa's eyes narrowed. "Why her?" He didn't offer a speech. "Because she sees the world in a way no one taught her to. Because she already belongs in rooms built for minds twice her age. Because she's already stepped through a door. My job is to make sure it doesn't close behind her." Rosa didn't answer right away. Her jaw tightened as she looked away, toward the hallway where her daughter had once waited in silence beside buckets and wires. That envelope sat between them like a fragile choice neither had fully asked for. Rosa didn't reach for the envelope. Her arms remained folded, eyes hard, her voice low and precise. "Men like you don't see girls like my daughter," she said. "You see what they can do, not who they are. You see potential and performance, but not the weight they carry to get there." Thomas stood still, absorbing her words without protest. She stepped closer, not to intimidate, but to make sure he heard her without interference. "Ellie is 9. Rosa continued, "and already she's had to make herself small to fit into spaces never meant for her. She doesn't draw anymore, she builds. She doesn't play, she studies wires. And you saw that and thought valuable, useful, brilliant, maybe. But did you see the child? Or just the system she could fix?" Her voice cracked but didn't break. "Because I've scrubbed floors beneath the feet of men who nod politely at me and never see my daughter curled behind a cart, drawing circuits on napkins. And now one of those men tells me she deserves a place." She shook her head. "Don't offer her escape if you don't intend to stay when it's hard. Don't promise a future if you'll disappear the moment she becomes inconvenient or ordinary." Thomas didn't interrupt. He knew this wasn't a conversation. It was a warning wrapped in maternal armor, and every word was earned. That night, after her shift ended and the building fell quiet, Rosa returned to their modest apartment tucked behind a faded laundromat on the east side of town. She opened the door with aching feet and a cluttered mind, her uniform still damp at the cuffs. Expecting to find Ellie asleep, she paused when she saw the soft pool of light spilling from the kitchen table. There, hunched over a nest of wires and plastic casing, sat her daughter, hair tied up with a rubber band, grease smudged on her cheek, completely absorbed. Ellie didn't notice her mother watching from the doorway. Her fingers moved with eerie precision, carefully rewiring the inside of a battered old transistor radio Rosa had found at a donation bin weeks ago. On the table beside her, scraps of graph paper were filled with clean, methodical diagrams, some mirrored, others reversed entirely, like she was building the radio backward just to understand it better. A hand-drawn schematic glowed faintly under the light, ink bleeding into the edge where she'd corrected a path with pencil. Rosa stepped closer, silent. Ellie leaned in, adjusting the antenna by a millimeter, then tapped a connection point with the back of a screwdriver, listening to the hum it gave in response. It wasn't play. It was understanding. Rosa felt something shift in her chest. Not pride exactly, and not fear, but a quiet, unmistakable recognition. This wasn't a child playing pretend. This was a mind reaching for something beyond the ordinary, building not because someone had asked, but because something inside her refused to stay quiet. The next afternoon, Rosa stood at the edge of the hallway just outside the janitorial supply room, arms crossed but no longer with suspicion this time, with something more fragile resolve. Thomas Hale waited nearby, the envelope still in his coat, slightly creased now, but no less significant. Rosa didn't greet him formally. She simply said, "You have something to offer. Then give it to her yourself." He looked at her, surprised by the shift. She held his gaze. "I won't take away her right to choose," she said. "I've spent my life making decisions for her where she waits, what she eats, what time we come and go, but this one, this moment, has to be hers." Her voice was calm, but her hands were tight at her sides, betraying the internal storm. If she says no, you walk away. No pressure, no persuasion, just the truth and a choice. Thomas nodded, understanding what was being entrusted to him. A few minutes later, Ellie walked down the hallway toward them, ponytail slightly askew, graphite on her sleeve. She noticed the envelope in his hand and slowed. He crouched slightly to meet her at eye level and extended it wordlessly. She took it with cautious fingers, opened it slowly, eyes moving across the neat type. Her lips formed each word in silence. Then she looked at her mother. Rosa gave a single nod, not of encouragement, but of trust. Ellie looked back at Thomas. "Do I have to go?" she asked quietly. "No," he said. "Only if you want to." She studied both of them for a moment longer, then tucked the letter into her sketchbook. "Then I'll think about it." And Rosa, watching from behind, let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Ellie didn't answer immediately. She kept the envelope pressed between her palms as if weighing its contents not by what was written, but by what it might cost. Her eyes flicked between Thomas and her mother, then down to the sketchbook she always carried, the one with tape on the spine and bent corners, its pages filled with half-finished circuits, curious questions, and diagrams drawn in the margins of grocery lists and cleaning schedules. She flipped to a page near the back where a schematic of a motion-triggered light sensor curved across the paper. She stared at it for a second, then looked up. "If I say yes," she said slowly, her voice small but steady, "I can still take stuff apart. Right?" Thomas blinked, then smiled, not out of amusement, but deep recognition. "That's the whole point," he said gently. "You don't have to stop fixing things. In fact, we hope you never do." Ellie nodded once, as if checking something off an internal list. She looked at her mother, who offered nothing but a quiet, steady gaze and a slight tilt of her head that said, "It's your call." Ellie took a breath, folded the letter carefully, and slid it into the back pocket of her jeans. "Okay," she whispered, "but I want to finish my project first." And in that moment, it was clear she wasn't just saying yes to a school, she was saying yes on her own terms. The school felt like another planet, From the moment Ellie stepped through the glass entry doors of the Vermont Institute of Technology for Youth, the air itself seemed thinner, quieter, sharper. The hallways were sleek, the lights humming with automated precision, and every student she passed walked with a posture that suggested they already knew where they were going, both literally and in life. Their uniforms were flawless pressed blazers, crested lapels, ties knotted with clinical neatness. Their conversations floated in clipped bursts of jargon neural mapping thresholds, reinforcement loops, recursive architectures. No one paused to sketch on napkins. No one sprawled on the floor beside a loose circuit board. The cafeteria sounded more like a panel discussion than a lunchroom, full of sentences like, "The bias in that data set is non-trivial." And, "Have you seen the beta results from the Singapore project?" Ellie wore secondhand jeans and a too big cardigan. Her shoes squeaked. She said little, absorbing the rhythm of this polished world where everything had a label. Everything followed a metric. No one made eye contact for long, and no one asked why her pencil was always in her pocket. There were no napkins with scribbles here, just tablets, whiteboards, and carefully moderated group chats. For the first time in a long while, Ellie felt not invisible, but exposed. Over the weeks that followed, something inside Ellie began to dim, slowly and quietly, like a signal fading beneath too much noise. At first, it was subtle. She stopped reaching for new diagrams, stopped sketching mid-thought. Her napkin stayed folded in her backpack, untouched. The schematics that once spilled across pages with spontaneous curiosity now came only when required. And even then, they were neat, safe, and unimaginative. She submitted assignments on time, technically correct and thoroughly explained, but without the spark that had once made her fingers itch for wire and tape. Creativity, once second nature, began to feel like a risk. In this world of structured excellence, of polished code and ranked deliverables, there was no room for broken radios or instinctive redesigns. Ellie stopped building new things and instead began only to fix what was already broken. She adjusted resistor values, rerouted existing circuits, debugged lines of code, but she no longer wondered what if. Her mind, once bursting with odd questions and strange loops, folded into itself, cautious and quiet. No one noticed, because nothing was technically wrong. But Ellie knew. She could feel it every time she chose silence over a question. Every time she erased a half-drawn concept and replaced it with what she thought they wanted to see. It happened on a Tuesday evening, long after the last shift had ended, and the downtown hotel hallways had emptied into silence. Rosa Miller. After mopping the final corridor and climbing 3 flights of stairs to deliver fresh linens, collapsed near the service elevator, her breath shallow and chest tight. For weeks she had been coughing, brushing it off as fatigue or a lingering cold, unwilling to miss a shift or risk the paycheck that kept Ellie's life afloat. But this time her body gave out before her will did. When the paramedics arrived, she was barely conscious. Her name whispered, like a fading signal, her janitor badge still clipped to her collar. The hospital admitted her with acute respiratory failure pneumonia, compounded by exhaustion and untreated infection. For 3 nights, no one at the school realized Ellie was missing. No alerts were raised. No teachers checked in. She had simply stopped showing up. A small absence in a system too large to notice. Ellie never left her mother's side. She curled in a chair beside the hospital bed, notebook clutched against her chest, watching every machine beep and blink with quiet desperation. It wasn't just Rosa's body that was worn down, it was years of invisibility catching up at once. Ellie left the academy without telling anyone. She packed her notebook, a pencil, and a spare hoodie into her bag and slipped out through the east gate just after dawn. Her absence unnoticed among the sea of schedules and checkboxes that defined her new world. No one asked why her chair in the second-floor lab remained empty. No one called when her assignment stopped appearing in the digital folder. The school's system, designed to track performance, missed the person behind the progress. Ellie returned to the hospital, where her mother lay motionless beneath layers of warm blankets and whispered oxygen. She moved like a shadow between vending machines and nurses' carts, surviving on crackers, weak coffee, and silence. On the third day, she folded a piece of paper carefully and walked to the Norwegian embassy across the street. She didn't write her name on it, didn't ask to see anyone. She just handed it to the guard and said, "For Mr. Hale." The message was handwritten in tight, deliberate letters. Sometimes the right wires are in the wrong place. No explanation, no return address, just a single line that said everything she couldn't say aloud, that she was out of place, disconnected, and calling out not for help, but for understanding. When Thomas Hale unfolded the damp piece of paper handed to him by the embassy staffer, he immediately recognized the handwriting compact, clean, and emotionally restrained. But it wasn't the penmanship that made him sit down in silence. It was the message itself. Sometimes the right wires are in the wrong place. To anyone else, it would seem cryptic or abstract. But to Thomas, it struck like a voltage spike straight to the chest. Ellie wasn't just talking about machines, she was talking about herself. She had been wired for something else, creativity, intuition. Systems that didn't come from textbooks, but from touch and memory and the academy, for all its prestige and promise, had placed her in the wrong configuration. She hadn't failed. The system had failed to hold who she truly was. She wasn't asking to quit. She wasn't even asking to be rescued. She was telling him, in the clearest terms she knew, that she didn't belong, not because she wasn't brilliant, but because brilliance without belonging is a slow kind of erasure. The quiet elegance of her words held no bitterness, only a plea to be seen on her own terms. And Thomas, who had once believed opening the door was enough, now realized that walking beside her was the part that mattered most. When Thomas Hale arrived at the hospital and saw Ellie curled beside her mother's bed, pale with exhaustion but still quietly holding on, something in him solidified. No press, no advisors, no paperwork, just a single decision that felt more necessary than anything he'd ever done in his decades of public service. After making sure Rosa was stable and resting, he turned to Ellie, crouching beside her with the same care he had shown in the hallway that first afternoon. He didn't ask for permission. He offered it. "You can stay with me for a while," he said softly, watching her eyes widen, not with excitement, but uncertainty. "Just until your mom gets better. I live in a quiet place outside the city. There's a spare room, a real kitchen, space to work, no uniforms, and no one watching over your shoulder." At first, Ellie said nothing. Her fingers clutched the edge of her notebook like a lifeline. "You mean like live there?" she asked cautiously. He nodded. "Only if you want. There's no pressure, no expectations, just space to breathe again." The idea settled slowly, like light through dust. She didn't smile, but something in her posture loosened. After days of silence, of being the one who had to stay strong, Ellie allowed herself to consider the offer not as an escape, but as a pause, a place where maybe she didn't have to carry everything alone. In the quiet of Thomas Hale's suburban home, a modest, single-story house nestled beneath tall oaks and rustling wind, Ellie found something she hadn't realized. She was missing stillness without pressure. They didn't speak much. Words weren't necessary. Most afternoons, after schoolwork was quietly set aside, they would sit at opposite ends of the workbench he'd cleared just for her, tools laid out in gentle invitation. Ellie brought scraps from old radios, salvaged LED strands, resistors, copper wire knotted into her backpack. Thomas would sometimes offer an old circuit diagram or a hand-drawn schematic with half of it missing an unspoken challenge. She never asked questions, just nodded slightly before pulling out her pencil. Side by side, they soldered and assembled, tested theories, rewired ideas. Sometimes Thomas would sketch something and slide it across the table. Ellie, without a word, would correct it, flipping logic paths, rerouting voltage, circling weak points. At other times, she'd hand him a napkin with strange, beautiful loops of circuit design he'd never considered. Their exchange was quiet, mechanical in the best way, like a perfectly calibrated machine humming in sync. There were no grades, no expectations, only the shared silence of two people who understood each other best when speaking through design. One rainy afternoon, as thunder murmured in the distance and the soft hum of the soldering iron filled the quiet, Ellie began sketching something new, different from anything Thomas had seen her attempt before. Her fingers moved quickly, confidently, drawing a loop that curved around symbols of light, frames, and fragments of expression. It wasn't just a translation tool, it was a reimagination. Ellie had been watching videos of refugee children, some of whom had lost not only their homes but their words, their ability to speak the same language as anyone around them. So she began designing a visual language translator, one that didn't rely on speech or written word but used images, colored lights, and pattern recognition to express core needs: hunger, pain, fear, safety. At the heart of the new circuit board was a matrix that interpreted gesture and expression, matching them with universally recognizable images and hues that pulsed gently to communicate. A crying face triggered a soft blue glow and a spoon icon. Raised eyebrows and a tense jaw sparked red light and a house symbol, urgent shelter. "It's for kids who don't have words left," Ellie whispered one night, not looking up, or who never had them to begin with. Thomas stared at the design, stunned by its empathy and elegance. Ellie wasn't just fixing broken systems anymore. She was inventing something entirely new. 1 year later, the air in Portland felt different, less hurried, more expectant as the global AI conference opened its grand doors once again. But this time, amid polished shoes, government badges, and flashing camera lenses, the most anticipated guest was neither a CEO nor a world leader. It was a 10-year-old girl from a working-class apartment block in East Portland, wearing sneakers 2 sizes too big and holding a simple notebook in her hand. Ellie had been formally invited back as the conference's honorary guest, her name now printed not on a janitor's clearance badge but engraved in brass beneath the title Innovator in Inclusive AI Systems. Her visual translator for refugee children had not only gone viral within humanitarian networks, but had been adopted by 4 major aid organizations. The room fell into a hush as she stepped onto the circular stage, not to give a grand speech, but simply to demonstrate her device using lights, gestures, and a quiet image of a sunflower glowing amber to signal hope. Thomas Hale stood in the front row, arms crossed, eyes misted, remembering the girl who once fixed a server while the world was breaking. Now, the world had begun to listen, and Ellie, small, calm, and radiant in her quiet brilliance, was ready. Ellie stood in front of the mirror that morning with a quiet defiance in her eyes. The wardrobe sent by the conference organizers sat unopened in the corner silks. Name brands, shoes that gleamed like mirrors, but she reached instead for the orange dress folded neatly at the bottom of her backpack. It was slightly frayed at the hem, the seams a little loose, but it was hers. It was the dress she wore the day she followed her mother into the conference center, the day she fixed a system no one else could even understand. It smelled faintly of dust and home, and as she slipped it on, she felt her shoulders drop, her breath even, her mind clear. At the venue, eyes followed her not with confusion this time, but with curiosity, reverence. Some whispered, expecting something more formal, more fitting for a global stage. But Ellie didn't flinch. She adjusted her sneakers, brushed the crumbs from her pocket, and walked with quiet pride down the long hallway of banners and spotlights. For all the protocols and polish around her, she knew the only way to belong in a world like this was not to become someone else, but to remain entirely, uncompromisingly, Ellie. The orange dress was not just fabric. It was a declaration: I am not your product. I am not your symbol. I am simply myself. Ellie stepped onto the stage as the lights dimmed, and the hush of expectation swept over the auditorium like a held breath. Hundreds of eyes stared up at her: scientists, officials, innovators, reporters waiting for the speech she would give, the insight they assumed she had scripted or rehearsed. But Ellie said nothing. She stood in her orange dress, small and still against the towering screens behind her, and from her canvas bag she pulled out a small object wrapped in cloth. Slowly, deliberately, she unwrapped it: a hand-built circuit board, no larger than her palm. Its wires tangled yet precise, its components patched together from bottle caps, broken radio parts, snapped headphones, and pieces of discarded tech she had salvaged from bins behind the academy. She held it up, not to show off, but to speak without words. The screen behind her displayed nothing. She didn't need it. The object glinted under the lights, raw and real. It was a translator, one that didn't use language but light, built for children who had no country, no common tongue, only eyes that still dared to hope. The audience was silent, not confused, not skeptical, just still, because in that moment, they understood this was not invention for applause. It was survival turned into compassion, built by a girl who never needed a podium to be heard. The silence that followed was not empty. It was reverent, electric, filled with the quiet thunder of understanding. No applause erupted. No cameras clicked. Even the live stream crew hesitated, unsure whether to break the moment with sound. The tiny circuit board in Ellie's hands, cobbled together from scraps, soldered with care, infused with meaning, glowed faintly under the warm stage lights. The board, though silent, spoke volumes. It was empathy translated into copper and code. It was the voice of every child who had been left out of systems too complicated, too cold. And in that moment, no one saw a poor girl in a hand-me-down dress. They saw the future looking back at them. A man near the front, a delegate from Ghana with tired eyes and a quiet soul, leaned toward his neighbor and whispered, barely audible but carrying through the stillness, "That little girl. She just reconnected the entire world." His words floated, suspended, then sank into the hearts of everyone present, not through fanfare, but through truth, through presence, through light. Ellie didn't smile, didn't bow. She simply lowered the board, returned it to her bag, and stepped down from the stage, her message already received, her purpose already known. She had done what systems couldn't. She had listened, seen, felt, and then she had built a bridge. They drove for hours through winding forest roads, the air crisp with early autumn and the smell of pine sneaking through the cracked windows of Thomas's old truck. Ellie sat quietly in the passenger seat, her hands tracing invisible circuits on the fogged glass while Thomas kept his eyes on the road, offering no grand speech or explanation. He had promised her something wordless, something that couldn't be translated through AI or logic, only felt. When they reached the summit near a clearing in Vermont's Green Mountains, The sky above them was already beginning to change. Hints of green and violet shimmered at the edges of the horizon like a secret whispering its way across the stars. They stepped out, boots crunching on the frosty grass, breath rising in clouds. Thomas laid out a worn blanket and said nothing, simply motioned for Ellie to sit. And then it began. The aurora unfolded slowly, like paint dropped in water, soft waves of color undulating across the night. Ellie's mouth parted slightly, her eyes reflecting the light show above. "They look like wires," she whispered, finally. "But not ones you fix. Ones that just exist." Thomas turned toward her, eyes misted by age and wonder. "Some connections don't need repair," he said softly. "They just need to be witnessed." She leaned against his shoulder, and together, under a sky no algorithm could explain, they watched the northern lights braid across the darkness like a living circuit, silent, perfect, whole. As the aurora continued to shimmer across the sky, casting quiet waves of green and violet over the mountain clearing, Thomas reached into his coat pocket and carefully pulled out a small velvet pouch. He didn't say a word, just offered it to Ellie with a quiet nod. Her fingers unwrapped the soft fabric with the same reverence she used when handling old circuits or broken wires. And inside she found a small custom microchip, delicate, warm to the touch, and engraved with 2 words in soft, etched lettering: Ellie. Hail. Her breath caught. It wasn't flashy or corporate. It was personal, human. Below the name, an even smaller inscription read Verba Lux words through light. It was the first fully functioning prototype they had built together, a microcontroller designed to help nonverbal children communicate using pulsing light patterns connected to emotional or need-based cues. Children who had no shared language, no voice, no bridge now had color, now had connection. "This is ours," she whispered. Thomas gave a small smile. "Yours. Really? But yes, ours." Ellie turned the chip over in her palm, marveling not just at the technology but at what it symbolized, the first creation that had not been about fixing the broken, but about building the new. A tool born not out of crisis, but of compassion. Something that didn't belong in a lab or on a shelf, but in small hands and quiet classrooms. "Thank you," she said finally. Voice trembling, Thomas only said, "The world's been waiting for you to speak in your own way. Now you've given that gift to others." Ellie sat quietly beneath the vast Vermont sky, the aurora still painting whispers of green across the night. She held the chip in her small hand, watching how the stars reflected in its polished surface. How something so small could carry something so big. Her voice, barely more than a breath, broke the silence. "Do you think they'll hear me?" Her eyes didn't leave the sky. But Thomas felt the weight in her words. He knew she wasn't asking about volume or even attention. She meant truly being heard, understood, seen. Thomas watched her for a moment before answering, then gently placed his hand beside hers on the rock they shared. "Maybe not right away," he said softly, "but they will understand." Ellie turned to look at him, her brow furrowed. "Even if I don't explain it right," Thomas nodded. "Especially then. Because what you're building, it doesn't just talk. It shows. It connects. It feels." Ellie looked down at the chip again, then up at the sky that stretched forever. "Like light?" she asked. "Like light," Thomas replied. "And light travels, even when no one sees it at first. It still moves, still reaches." Ellie tucked the chip carefully into her jacket pocket, the engraved name warm against her chest. She said nothing more, but her eyes sparkled, not from the stars above, but from the quiet belief blooming inside her. Maybe she didn't have to be loud to be heard. Maybe she only had to shine. Ellie sat with her legs folded beneath her on the cold granite, eyes tracing the fading lights above as if memorizing the way they danced across the night. In her pocket, the chip pressed lightly against her heart, not as a symbol of achievement, but as a quiet promise to those the world had forgotten to listen to. She didn't dream of applause or headlines or her name on a plaque. She didn't need stages or awards. What she needed, what she wanted, was simple to make a bridge, invisible maybe, but strong enough for someone who couldn't speak to reach someone who could listen. She imagined a little boy in a refugee shelter tracing shapes of color through a wall of light, and a nurse somewhere watching and suddenly understanding. She imagined a girl who never talked, whose hands trembled too much for sign language, pointing to a glowing pattern and being understood for the very first time. That was enough. Ellie didn't need to be known. The light didn't need to say where it came from. It just needed to shine. And if one child, just one, could find a way to say, "I'm here," because of what she built then, every wire, every soldered scrap, every lonely moment she spent in silence had been worth it. Recognition was for names, but connection that was for souls. In a world obsessed with noise, recognition, and speed, Ellie's story reminds us of something deeper, something quietly revolutionary. Sometimes, the most powerful impact isn't made by the loudest voice in the room, but by the quiet hands in the background, building something that changes lives. Ellie didn't crave credit. She didn't chase spotlight or legacy. She just wanted people to connect, to be seen, heard, and understood, even without words. And that's a lesson we all need. Not everyone is given a voice, but everyone deserves to be listened to. Whether you're a parent, a teacher, a leader, or simply someone walking past a child with wondering eyes, pause. Observe. Ask yourself not what they can say, but what they might be trying to show you. The world doesn't change from above. It shifts from the ground, one small connection at a time. So maybe the next time you feel invisible, unheard, or unsure of your worth, remember, Ellie, your value is not measured by applause, but by the lives you quietly touch. And if you've ever felt like the right wire in the wrong place, maybe your moment isn't about being seen, it's about helping others see. If this story moved you, share your thoughts in the comments. Who is your Ellie, or what quiet moment changed your life? Don't forget to save this video for a day you need reminding. And if you believe in stories that heal, connect, and inspire, subscribe to the channel, because someone out there is still trying to find the right words, and maybe, just maybe, this story is the light they need.